All right. I wanted to give a shout out for one of the sponsors for this event. It is Endor Labs. Endor Labs is a startup that is tackling one of the biggest challenges of today, which is the supply chain security. They have built a platform that helps you find out the vulnerabilities that matter in the supply chain security and the CI/CD pipeline that come from ingesting open source software so that the developers can focus on developing secure code and not get drowned in useless alerts. So that's what we have. Go check them out. And so now let's go on to the next session. All right, welcome to the software security maturity model of the conference. We are quite excited to share this. This came about after several discussions within the Purple Book community leaders on where the Purple Book, on where the application security is headed. And one thing that became quite clear is that in future, the community felt application security will not be just about application security. Application security will actually see, in order to secure applications, we need to secure the convergence of application security with infrastructure security and also the cloud security. So the maturity model that we are building will actually look into those aspects, and so that's why it's called software security maturity model, not just application security maturity model. So it's a more holistic view of this. So before going into the details about it, I'd like to also talk about one of the event supporters here. It is Resilient Software Security. Resilient Software Security is an organization that helps small, like startups and small and medium businesses with their application security software. They have experts that can help assess your maturity along the software security path and help you achieve that maturity. All right. So coming back to the maturity model now. So as I said, the community wanted to look at a maturity model that is forward-looking, that looks into the convergence of these different technologies that we talked about. Also, the community wanted to come up with a simple framework that any companies, a small company or big enterprise, could use as a starting point for assessing the maturity of their application security program. So the model itself is customizable, so to say, and also the model is extensible. Model is extensible in that the community members felt that each one of their organizations, even though they fit in a particular category, like small, medium, large, and for particular industry, all of them had their unique perspective and unique level of maturity organizational structure. So they wanted a model that they could take as a start baseline and build on top of it, basically extend it to make it their own. So that's what this particular maturity model hopes to achieve. And this maturity model, by no means is 1.2 version yet. It is a 0.5 version, and it is totally open sourced by the community leaders for the community leaders. So basically built by the security leaders and the experts and the professionals for the wider security community. So we invite you to be part of these next few sessions, take an active role in the workshops, take what you can from this to maybe immediately apply in your work setting, and also give us feedback. That's very, very important. We call it a 0.5 version. And over the next 5 to 6 months, we will engage. This is the first point where we will engage, take feedback, make it better. We'll come back and have workshops, in-person workshops, virtual workshops that you can join to basically provide feedback and make it better, and also take the increasingly better version of this model to your organization. You can join these workshops if you're interested in joining in-person workshops, maybe New York, Atlanta, Chicago, different cities. Go to purplebook.club /yes3em2. thepurplebook.club /yes3em2. Okay. So we'd love to see you in those workshops. But for now, sit back and enjoy or actually rather take an active part and enjoy the engage with the sessions that are coming up. And we look forward to hearing your feedback on this.
Hello. My friend Helen Umberger and I are going to introduce you to the Scalable Software Security Maturity Model from the Purple Book community, affectionately known as S3M2. Helen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I've been in the IT industries for over 20 years, mostly as a software architect. I specialize in highly regulatory industries like utilities, insurance, and finance. My focus is heavily on data security and the security of financial systems. I have a master's of software engineering and a CISSP. Back to you, Brook.
Thank you. I'm the author of 6 books, author of 6 books on software security. I've led a bunch of programs at various companies you've heard of, like Cisco and Intel, and been kicking around high tech for almost 40 years, not quite, and security for about 25. So yeah, I've been around a long time. My friends affectionately refer to me as the elder AppSec diplomat. So that's kind of my thing. And I'm really happy here to be talking about something new from the Purple Book community. Before we start, we'd like to ask you to think just a little bit about your experiences with software security or any maturity model for that matter. Have you ever used one? Just think about your experiences there. And, how did you use it? What would you want from a model? What was missing the time that you did use it or the times that you did use it? Consider for a moment the challenges that you encountered with that maturity model. And finally, consider if it was imposed upon you. So why might we want to add another maturity model? Well, development practices have been changing. When some of these things we have listed on this slide, like cloud and agile, shift left, or machine learning, started to come in, they appeared to be separate and unrelated threads. But by now, this is the way software is built. There's been a conjunction. Many organizations have cloud instances, and maybe that's their major focus. Today, you can source through a software as a service offering almost any corporate function. Cloud is normal. DevOps is how you develop and deliver to the cloud. Agile, most shops at least pay some attention to agile. There's very few places that are using waterfall, and they have reasons to do that. All of these things have come together, and so much of what we're seeing today involves, even if it's just a side part of the data processing, some machine learning. It doesn't have to be a chatbot that's the focus. So all of these things have come together in the way that software is built and what it does. And so that's very different from where some of the models, many of the models have been started or thought, how they thought about software development in the past. And so there's been a constant change, and I would expect that pace of change to continue. So we thought it would be important to account for that. Helen, tell us about regulatory environments, please.
I will, but I do want to add one more thing to those development practice changing. What I am seeing as the citizen development and the things like that ChatGPT, it's come to the point where your very savvy business users are starting to bleed over into your AppSec area, basically. but they do not have the security background. So you need a lighter framework that you can extend and share with your business folks, especially if they're buying services and they're skipping the IT process. You really need to, at a corporate level, start bringing in a framework that's light enough that you can include people outside of your AppSec. And yet it is your AppSec team that is going to be responsible for this in the end, especially when they start inheriting that citizen development code. There's no putting that genie back in the bottle. It's too easy. It's too wonderful for the business folks. There used to be a time when we could centralize our IT and keep that shadow IT under, but no, shadow IT is going to become pretty mainstream in most companies. So it's something to keep in mind. Changing regulatory environment. Obviously, this is a huge focus for me because I've been in highly regulated businesses, but I'm starting to see that this is going to impact companies that never considered it before. And the reason, of course, is the machine learning. I've been looking at the European GDPR, the privacy. It has big sections on AI and machine learning. The opt-out, the opt-in, the right to be forgotten, all of these things are going to become an issue for us because we already have states adopting mini clones of this law. You're going to have to start keeping track of your data separate from your applications on who's allowed to be in a training model and who's not. One of the examples I've already seen in a company that doesn't normally care about regulations because they don't deal with finance or utilities was Weight Watchers. They got hit by a huge fine by the FTC because they were using the data of minors, people under 18. You can't use their data in your machine learning, especially if you haven't run it by legal. It is time for people to start thinking of the changing regulatory environment, because if you want to use ChatGPT and you want to use all this neat machine learning stuff, you're going to fall under regulations and it's going to start getting tight. And as things go along and you see deep fakes, there's going to be more and more regulations, and that's going to hit every company, not just the highly regulated companies or the feds. So it's time to start thinking of that and start expanding your framework around that. That brings us to the changing profile of attackers. When this all started a long time ago, it was that super genius who, as recreation for fun, wanted to show he was smarter than everyone else, and he hacked into the system. But then it was seen as something that could make money, so criminals started to do it. And when it made a lot of money, and I think Brook quoted me some huge, ungodly amount, I don't remember the amount, but it was in the billions, it went to organized crime. And now we have the worry that there's state sponsorship behind some of these groups to do not just stealing your money, but maybe sabotaging. And now it's going to get faster. You thought it was fast now, how quickly all these 0 days came out and all this other stuff. But if AI generated hacking code starts to be developed, it'll come out even faster. So now we need a light framework that handles the speed of the change in our environment, our regulatory, and who we're being attacked by. Which brings us to the last point, which is Brook's.
And that number, by the way, was in 2011 or 2012, and it came from the FBI. They estimated that in that year, the Russian mobs, just from cybercrime, would make $12 billion. And so, yeah, I'm sure it's greater now, and many other cybercrime organizations involved. That's just one. So yes, it's a serious problem and there's a lot of loss. One of the things we wanted to do was not compete with the models that exist, but fill gaps and complement. And we'll get into in a moment, and a later slide, specifics, but just as an introduction as the why build another model, we wanted to fill some gaps and build something that had a little bit different reach. And we'll go into that in subsequent slides. So we're complementing models, not replacing them. So one thing that we want to talk about is what's in this new model and what's it based on. Well, first, the security practices that are in the model are based on a bunch of research into if there's an industry consensus. And I was pleased to be part of this research at Intel in 2015 and 16, along with Robert Hale and Catherine Blackadder Nelson, where we looked at every published security development life cycle. And we realized that once you normalize the names of activities, because they could be named different things, and once you understood what they were, there was a huge amount of consensus. Basically, all the SDLs or SDLCs out there, pretty much the same. We know what it takes to try and produce secure software. So if you want to see as examples of what we're talking about here, Microsoft SDL represents a very modern SDL, not pushing their SDL particularly, but it represents an industry consensus pretty closely. There's an industry consensus SDL based on the Intel research in the book Building in Security at Agile Speed. So, as examples that you could look at. But this that we're talking about today, this S3M2, involves the industry consensus on what you need to do. Helen, how does it scale?
That's one of the focuses. We looked at some of the models, and one of the gaps was that it wasn't very good for a starting company, a startup. It wasn't very good for small companies that were never going to grow huge because they're not dealing in highly regulated areas. So we wanted something that scaled for companies of all sizes, from the smallest, one-person shop upwards to the multinationals, because we feel that some of the models are neglecting the smaller end. For contextual maturity, there was another thing. And some of those models, the whole point is to progress from one state to another. You go up through 1 through 5 or whatever. That doesn't make sense for a lot of companies, especially your mid-size or your small companies. We wanted to show what the maturity was at the appropriate level for you. You're not going to spend your entire budget on security, so you needed something more contextual. You may not ever get to the final optimum stage because it's not necessary for what you're doing. So we wanted to show what was the options and what would be the best practices in the area that you're at. And now that brings us to the risk.
And that's precisely the point of being risk-driven. Risk is contextual, and every organization is different. Every industry, every product has its own needs from a risk tolerance perspective. And so we wanted to build a model that would account for various levels of risk, that wouldn't say, hey, everybody's got to be at level 3 or level 5 in order to handle their risk, but so that you can take your contextual maturity into account. And we tried to think very hard as we built this model. If a company had this kind of a risk posture, what would they need at a particular level, or what level might they need to attain to meet their risk needs? And so risk, is a driver in this model. And also, hopefully, it is our sincere hope that you can apply your risk situation to this model effectively. So who are we? Helen, who are we, this Purple Book community?
So the group that's getting together and that's trying to put together this framework, which I do want to point out isn't done. We want to get feedback from you in these workshops that are going to deep dive into every section. It's cross-cultural, it's cross-jurisdiction, it's across all kinds of different industries of all different sizes and experience. Not everyone on here is management or a CISO. It's basically the people who see themselves as security champions who are trying to give back to the community. So it is open to a lot of people. And basically this becomes a grassroots kind of thing that's going on. And that brings us to the community group that Brook wanted to emphasize.
Yeah, we're a community. The Purple Book is a community. Vendors, we're vendor neutral. Vendors their security people can certainly come. They're not, they're welcome. Anyone who cares about security is welcome. However, it's not vendor. It's not an organization. It's not a trade group. It's not an association. It's a community. And as such, we have a wealth of experience. People have contributed to this maturity model have, come from, as Helen said, a variety of roles. And there's some people who are fairly new to software security and AppSec, and people who are old hands and have been around a long time, people who are up in management, down in management, but we're colleagues and we're peers, and it's an input from a community of interest. And I think that makes the drivers a little bit different than an association or a trade group might have. So for a moment, I want to just touch on some of the other famous models or well-known models. We certainly are aware of these models, and we are standing on their shoulders. There's no doubt about it. And again, we're not replacing 𝗣𝗕𝗖, we're not replacing 𝗤𝗄𝗄𝗃 by any means. And they're, really fine. They do what they do very, very well. And so, this isn't a competition. We hope to fill in a gap or slot into a place that we see is underserved or less served. So let's talk a little bit about 𝗣𝗕𝗖. 𝗣𝗕𝗖, I've been subject to a couple of 𝗣𝗕𝗖s. I've spoken at their conferences. I know a lot of people over there. I know a lot of the people who've worked on it. We've talked about how they do it and why they do it. It's very robust and very rigorous. It's not, there is a cost to a 𝗣𝗕𝗖 assessment. Of course, you can self-assess, of course, but there's a cost to a 𝗣𝗕𝗖 assessment, and it's fairly hefty. So that's important, because the organizations that can afford that investment tend to be organizations that have already an established program that is already in some ways mature in some areas at least. And they're trying to assess, well, where should we go next? And what do our peers do? So it's basically peers of established or larger organizations. And most importantly, while it's a universe of capabilities of what every one of those, they take what every organization has done. And so there's a universe of things, probably everything in AppSec that you can do, but it is by definition non-prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what you should do. It tells you what your peer group does and how mature they are at those things. And that's very important to realize. So while that's really interesting and highlights a lot of things in the AppSec world, it's great data, it may not fit if you're a small organization trying to figure out, where do I start and what should I do next? It may not tell you. And again, it's by definition non-prescriptive. They wanted data. Then there's 𝗤𝗄𝗄𝗃. 𝗤𝗄𝗃 is a maturity model. So 𝗣𝗕𝗖 is a capabilities model. 𝗤𝗄𝗃 is a maturity model. And it tells you how you would mature if you know what you need to be doing. Now, they do say there's 5 areas, I believe. And so they're saying you should be play in every one of these areas. So in that way, it does tell you some of what you need to be working on, but it's not really specific. Instead, it focuses on how you mature what you're doing. And it's really good at that. But, again, for the organization that's maybe got some things going, what do they do next? Where are the best investments? How do they move to the next level? 𝗤𝗄𝗃 will tell them how they build their program, but it doesn't necessarily tell them what to do. So basically, this model, S3M2, is both a maturity model and a capabilities model. It is based on some hard research on what you should do, what you must do in order to have robust software security. So it's a little different. Now, there's some older models that are capabilities models and maturity models. There are some. They're a bit past date, I'm sorry to say. And so, while we looked at those, we thought, yeah, this doesn't really help for the way software is built today as much as it could. Another driver here. And some models are local and unique, which is great if it works for a particular instance, but we're trying to build something that will fit a lot of cases and be more generalized. I'll repeat one more time. This is from a community, not a vendor, not a trade group. Anything to add, Helen, before I go on?
I don't think so. I think we're getting a little short on time, so we should move on to attributes. This is the transition. We're going to go over some of the sections of the framework. However, we're not going to get in deeply because you guys are going to attend these workshops and you're going to give us your feedback. You're going to tell us you hate it, you love it, we missed something, because we're not finished, and you're going to help us on this journey. So why don't we move on?
And you'll see on the screen basically the structure of the model. I'll just point that out, and we're going to go over that as we go into these next slides, but you can see it here. That's the structure, how the model is structured.
So here we wanted to address people, how they're impacted by the framework. One of the things we had noted earlier, and I think that's the story you wanted to talk about, is sometimes companies impose frameworks and the people who it's imposed on are either not familiar with it, hate it, find it's not useful, it's too cumbersome, it doesn't work. So we wanted to look and focus on the people and see how it could help them. And we then put it in the different categories of which maturity level it is. And we're looking at reactive. That would be a lone developer who cares about security, but there's no programs or corporate support for them. Which brings you up to proactive, where maybe you're a dedicated resource or there's some kind of security training at your company. It may not relate to what you really need, but at least it's there, bringing you up to a place where you have security champions, someone who's taken on that role, either it was assigned to them or they gave it to themselves, which is usually the most effective, who can actually talk to management, who can talk to business and can make it clear what the needs are and start getting the company interested in investing in it. Optimization is when your developers are starting to join communities where they're getting feedback external from the company, and they're really starting to see how security would impact and help their company. Dynamic is when your security champions can be part of those communities and actually return, give something back to the world at large, not just their companies. And this is very high level. And in the framework, it goes into more of what can you support these people at each of these levels, and what it is they do and how you define it. And maybe you look ahead, but you don't need to go to the very end if you're a small company, but you do need to improve your stance. So it's the whole going from a lone person to a champion to a community to being a contributor. And I think that is very important. And it was one of the emphasis of the new framework. And I think we're ready to move on, unless you have something to add.
No, let's move on to process. Again, the buckets here are, you start sort of ad hoc or reactive. What do I need to do? Oh my gosh, this driver is causing me to do this. I can't pay attention to everything at once. And we end up in a situation where you're at data-driven decisions. Now, what you see on this slide are just a few of the things that are in each of these categories. We just picked and choose to give you a sense of flavor of the sorts of things you'll see in the model. But, you know, at reactive, you might do catch-as-catch-can fixes. Okay, this customer is screaming about this problem, so I'm gonna deal with it so I can make it. And oh, this customer is screaming about that. And one of my developers said, no, we can't go out because there's this vulnerability in my stack that I have to fix, and the internet is blowing up around it. That's reactive. When you get to the next level, you start saying, okay, let's start dealing with some of this stuff. Let's get the obvious things fixed before we go to market, before we deploy. But you begin to get some sense of what you have. For instance, these are just for instances, examples. There's a lot more in the model, but you know, as an example, you might start addressing the low-hanging fruit, the easy to remove vulnerabilities. Like you might be using 𝗕𝗬𝗏 in GitHub because it's available and it tells you about some vulnerabilities in your dependency tree. And you might say, yeah, well, this is revenue producing, so I need to pay attention to it. By the time you get to managed, you really probably have a risk process, hopefully, and you have some governance. That is, you have some quality control. I want things to be done well, and I'm checking to see that they're done, and you're probably measuring some things. That's a managed situation, and for many organizations that may be just fine. Optimized, you begin to get automation, and you also get dashboards of, how are things running, how are things going, how much adoption do I have of threat modeling, that sort of thing. How many requirements are getting built, whatever you need to look at, how many vulnerabilities of critical nature are closed before we go to deploy, and or you have a situation where somebody can say, yeah, don't deploy, you can't deploy with that vulnerability because it's too dangerous. By the time you get to dynamic, those decisions should be automated. A great example of that is my friend Christoph Kern told me they had a library that did escaping of inputs for cross-site scripting to remove cross-site scripting problems, and they would break the build if that library wasn't called on web inputs. Very automated. They didn't really need to do anything. That's dynamic, where you can handle a changing world in a really seamless way. Anything to add, Helen?
Nope, that sounds pretty good. Which brings us to technology. So at the reactive area, what we were seeing is a lot of technical debt, very few tools that were specific for security, and they were probably open source with no licenses and very limited in what they could do, that you probably don't have a secure design practice in place yet. When you go up to proactive, you start seeing paid licenses for your security tools. You see visible testing tools, your static testing, your pen testing. You see mandated tool sets. Now, this is still maybe a problem because they may be a mandated tool set from above, and they may not be what the developers want to use. You really need more of an input from your team on those. You start seeing hardening of your systems, and you start seeing the use of frameworks. At managed, you start seeing security frameworks and libraries and the tracking of metrics, better tools. And you start looking at your data and your identifications, and you've got KPIs and SLAs. Optimize, you're hoping that you've got a pipeline and you have some automation and you've got trends and you've got a better way of governance and checking. But the dynamic, we come back to that break the build. You've automated your pipeline. Everything is automated. You are doing constant development and deploy, and you're breaking the build. That is the ultimate. And yeah, that gets a little spendy, but once you have it, it becomes so worth it. So these are the things we were starting to look at in the technology stack for specifically security for your AppSec development teams. Did you
One thing I will add, if you don't mind, Helen, is in the model, as you'll see if you go to the technology workshop, there's one on each of these areas. We've focused a lot on secure design. There's been an increased awareness that we have to do security design, and that's baselined or the foundation is threat modeling. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about secure design and what you need and how that can grow. So you'll find that the one row is actually devoted to secure design.
Right. So we see secure design being enforced on the managed, and that's the start of threat modeling, but optimize would be where you mandate threat modeling for what you consider high value applications. But this is just a pick and choose from the various things at each of the levels. There's a lot more to it. And yeah, somebody likes their threat models.
Well, hopefully people will threat model.
Yes.
Finally, there's one area which affects everything else, and that's how do you invest? And we've just scratched the surface here, and that was our intention. But we did want to mention that there is one road devoted to investment and cost, and how one thinks about that as one matures. And again, there's underinvesting. You start thinking about tools, just as Helen just said, you began to invest more in people and processes. You begin to get to managed and automation. I mean, this is very simplistic. You begin to invest a lot more in automation and in people in process support or are supported by that automation. And you get into proactive controls at the dynamic so that you can handle change and movement. Just to close off, remember we asked you some questions at the beginning. Now we're going to ask you kind of the same. Might S3M2, might it help you? Might you be able to use it? Really help us to design a maturity model that's covers our values and our objectives if we get some feedback from you. So we really appreciate that. If S3 might be useful to you, how? What's missing? Did we miss something, or are we wrong-headed about something? Deep dive workshops are coming. Stick around, please attend the deep dive workshops and learn all about S3M2. Thanks very much.
Thank you.